Hey, coaches. I've been really looking forward to getting to this stage of our tools and resources in relation to mindsets, emotional intelligence, and now flow. Out of all of the different theories in the fields of positive psychology and coaching, flow is one of those foundational ones. And so it's one of those obvious things that we're going to ask ourselves, how do we coach around flow? Because when we look at the content, when we look at the research and the book, the TED Talk, all the different stuff out there about flow, it can feel a bit heady, a bit heavy. And to bring that much depth into a coaching session would really put us into the position of a teacher. So with this session, we're going to begin, or we're going to take time to look at how can we leverage the essence of the theory of flow in a coaching space, either implicitly or explicitly. So the way we do it clearly, explicitly, would be to use something like this. It's a wheel of flow. It should be very familiar in the field of coaching, that we can pretty much take any idea and make a wheel of life out of it. As with any kind of wheel, this can be used to get a sense of how this individual, how the client feels about a given task they're doing, their overall job experience. And it starts with a sense of how satisfied are they as a whole. Since there are 7 main concepts that I'm bringing into this version of a flow wheel, 7 main concepts of flow, this top one about overall satisfaction, it's just that's going to be the overall rating. Let's say on a scale of 1 to 7, scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your current satisfaction with this job, with this work, with this task? And from there, we can help them consider each of those other elements. So let's take a little bit of time to look at this wheel in action. But as we do this, I just want to highlight, like we said with the emotional intelligence mind map, it is not important for you to go into a coaching session saying, hey, let me give you this really fancy resource that I'm going to half teach you and train you in and half coach you around. And here it is. You don't have to do that. If the individual, you have this sense the individual would have value out of visualizing their flow experience with a task, their job, their work, then share something like this wheel. And if not, either guide some of your questions around flow in these categories, or maybe share with them that you have a series of questions to ask them to help them have an optimal experience with this work, or to optimize it further, or to bring it up a little bit closer to an optimal level. All of those are fair, bringing the experience from a 3 to a 5, or a 5 to a 7, or a 7 to a 9. All of those are relevant and valuable jumps in terms of an optimal experience. And as we coach around these different categories, we're really seeing how this person can lift up towards optimal experience and flow. So let's take a look at these categories, and we are going to start with clarity. So with clarity, this is all about how clear the task is. How clear is their job description? How clear are the expectations from their job? How clear is the actual process of how do I do this? If I'm building furniture, how clear are my instructions? Would be an illustration of this idea. So questions that we could ask: how clear are the responsibilities and expectations? How well do you know how to be successful with this work or with this task? And what do you need to know in order to have clarity? So with all of these, there's the sense of exploration and unpacking, but also how do you make things better? And regardless of what you see on these screens with the suggested questions, know that those are the main categories we're looking at. Unpack the current state of this element and challenge towards a better state. What could you do to gain more clarity from your manager about the expectations for this role? What could you do to gain more clarity about how to do this task? Who could you ask to gain more clarity, and so on? So this is helping bring that clarity maybe from a 2 to a 4 and have a little marginal improvement on the overall engagement, satisfaction, optimal experience. Next, we have the idea of achievability. Now, achievability is going to look at how doable this work is, how achievable it is. So let's take a look at some of those questions now. How confident are you in completing this work? How comfortable are you, you might even ask, with this type of task? How doable does it feel or achievable? I like doable. It just sounds more personable. So how doable does this feel? What would you change about the work? If you had a magic wand, what would you change about the task to make it feel more achievable, doable? Now, this is separate, and there's going to be some subtle distinctions in these areas. This is not agency, which we'll look at in just a bit. It's doable, achievable. What would you change to make it more achievable? As you ask these questions, there's probably going to be overlap with the other categories, but these are ways we can just drill down into the achievability of the task. And so next, we look at challenge. The achievability and challenge, this is really reflecting the quadrants of flow. So the more achievable, the closer things are to one's skill, the better, and the more challenging, the better. So we want to ask questions around challenge, but when we're looking at the wheel of life and applying it to flow, this is the one that you need to contextualize the most. When this wheel looks at challenge, it's looking at the optimal, that sweet spot of challenge. So how close are you to not being over-challenged and not being under-challenged with this task? How close are you to that sweet spot on a scale of 1 to 10? And in a session, just in general questions, how close are you to a sweet spot of challenge, feeling perfectly challenged in this experience? How balanced is the difficulty in getting the work done? And what would you need to change in order for this to be more challenging if they're saying it's not, or less challenging if they're saying it's too much? Then we get into agency. How much agency does the client have in directing, changing, achieving this task, this work? So what level of involvement do you have in directing your work and dictating your work and designing your work? How much say do you have over this task? And what would it take to make adjustments? What would it take to have more agency, to have your voice heard with this work? All of these looking to leverage that sense of ownership and agency. I have a voice to be heard when it comes to this task, job, or work. And next up, we look at focus. How well can the client focus when they are doing this type of work? So some questions here would be, how often do you find yourself distracted? At what points do you find yourself most focused? At what points do you find yourself least focused? When do you find yourself most distracted? If you're to break this task down into 5 different parts, what would they be? And which of those parts are least distracting and most distracting? And what could you change about your setting to create more focus? What could you change about your system to create more focus? What could you change about your relationships with others involved to create more focus? And so on. Again, I just want to reiterate, the questions here are only template questions, and I would encourage you to come up with your own. Whatever's coming up in a session, of course, you can bring those into the way you do the exploration. The next one is a bit of a hard one to measure. Again, you want to contextualize this, but it's that sense of timelessness. When the person is doing this thing, how much or how likely would they be to lose a sense of time, to see time just fly by? So questions we can ask around this would be, what would happen if you did lose track of time with this work? So what we're asking there is there even an ability for this individual to lose track of time? Or are they looking at needing to do this task within a 15 minutes and they've got a hard stop right beforehand and a hard stop after? They have to, the entire time they're doing this thing, they have to keep an eye on the clock. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to get to that next number one priority that they're having to run to, the next fire they've got to put out. When that's in that situation, It's going to prevent the client from being able to have the sense of timelessness. How does time feel when you do this work? And what part feels most slow? What part allows you to lose all sense of time? Or what part feels most fast? Timelessness. What could you do to offer yourself more space so that you can lose track of time? How could you build a system that will help you recover and get ready for the next thing while still letting you fully focus on this task without having to worry about the time? That's a really long question. This is more the kind of thing that you can explore towards timelessness. And finally, we have intrinsically motivating. Now, this is somewhat separate from overall satisfaction. Overall satisfaction is looking at the entire package. Intrinsic motivation is that sense of enjoyment just because you're doing it. Just because you are doing this task, you enjoy it. So questions we can ask to help explore this, unpack it, as well as maybe leverage towards it. What part of this work is just plain fun? And what part of this work would you most prefer to pay others to do? Implied in this is that sense of delegation or setting this aside. You can also ask, what would happen if you set that work completely aside for a month? And this isn't a suggestion, it's just saying what happens in that case. When do you feel most like you are enjoying this work? And what is a task that you are intrinsically motivated by? Or what's a task outside of this job, outside of this work that you would love to do, you would love to volunteer no matter what? And then next question might be, what might you be able to take from that type of experience and apply here, if anything? So these are ways to increase awareness around flow and to see if we can push a little bit more towards that optimal experience. We can use a wheel, and the nice thing about using this wheel of flow is that they can get a picture of it now, and after a month of pushing these different elements, improving some things a little bit here and there, they can reassess themselves, self-report, and see if anything's changed for the way they perceive this job, this work. And if something has, that's great. If something hasn't, or if it's gone down, well, that's great too. It's good to know because that can help them make decisions, help them have better conversations with their managers, their leaders, their team to make sure they're moving closer towards optimal experience. Because in that space, professionals, people in general, we do better work. We have better lives. So the more we can push towards that, the better. Thank you for coaching, and thank you for helping the people you work with experience optimal flow.